We got a call about someone who didn't look like they belonged here. I need to see some ID.
I live here. I'm literally washing my car in my own driveway.
Just cooperate and we'll be done here.
You're really gonna do this?
Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be.
I'm Sergeant Darnell Whitmore. I'm sure you recognize my name. Now I need your badge number because you're in big trouble.
The Sunday morning of February 12, 2023, began peacefully for Sergeant Marcus Thompson, who had planned a relaxing day off after working 5 consecutive 12-hour shifts, supervising night patrols at the police department. He woke up early, had coffee, and decided to finally wash his car, something he had been putting off for weeks. Wearing comfortable casual clothes, a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, he dragged his hose and bucket to his driveway, put some music on his phone, and began soaping up his sedan. But at 9:11 a.m., a patrol car slowed down in front of his house, and a junior officer Marcus directly supervised at work exited the vehicle and approached him with suspicion. What happened in the next 15 minutes would be captured by the officer's body camera and become one of the most surreal and embarrassing examples of racial profiling ever documented. A case where an officer stopped and questioned his own sergeant without recognizing him, costing the officer his career and exposing deep systemic failures in how some police saw black citizens. Marcus Thompson was 37 years old and had served in the police department for 15 years, rising through the ranks from patrol officer to detective to supervising sergeant. He was respected by his colleagues for his professionalism, deep knowledge of police procedures, and commitment to community policing that prioritized building trust rather than just making arrests. Marcus supervised a team of 12 officers on the night shift, responsible for performance evaluations, disciplinary decisions, and ensuring his team followed both the law and departmental policies. He lived in Riverside Heights, a middle-class suburban neighborhood where he had purchased his home 3 years earlier, a modest one-story residence with a small front lawn and driveway where he parked his personal black sedan. The officer who had stopped Marcus that morning was Kyle Peterson, a 24-year-old recruit who had graduated from the police academy just 8 months earlier and was currently in his probationary period working under Marcus's direct supervision. Peterson was on day shift that Sunday, patrolling residential neighborhoods as part of his routine assignments. He had interacted with Marcus multiple times at the department during shift changes and briefing meetings, but apparently had never seen his sergeant out of uniform or considered that Marcus was a real person with a personal life outside work. Peterson had also shown troubling signs during his first months of patrol, including a tendency to make pretextual stops of black motorists and an inability to articulate clear, reasonable suspicion when questioned about his actions. Peterson would later claim he was responding to a vague report of suspicious activity in the area, though dispatch records showed no call corresponding to that time or location. What really appeared to have triggered Peterson's stop was seeing a black man washing a Baha'ur, relatively new car in a neighborhood where he apparently assumed black residents didn't belong or were automatically suspicious. Peterson slowed down, watched Marcus working, and made the decision to investigate what he perceived as a potentially suspicious situation. He activated his body camera per protocol, parked his patrol car on the street, and walked toward Marcus's driveway with the body language and attitude of someone approaching a possible criminal suspect. Marcus was focused on scrubbing soap onto his windshield when he noticed Peterson approaching. His first reaction was professional confusion, wondering if something had happened in the neighborhood that required police response, perhaps a break-in or incident he should know about as the resident sergeant. But then he saw Peterson's expression, the hand positioning near the weapon, the cautious posture Marcus immediately recognized from training countless recruits on how to approach suspicious individuals. Marcus realized with growing shock that Peterson was approaching him, Marcus, as if he were a potential suspect. The absurdity of it took a moment to register. Peterson was literally investigating his own supervising sergeant in casual clothes, washing a car in his own driveway. Marcus put down his sponge and turned to face Peterson fully, expecting recognition to register in the young officer's eyes. Surely Peterson would recognize his sergeant, the man who directly supervised his work, conducted his performance evaluations, and had personally trained him on proper procedures just weeks earlier. But Peterson looked at him without any sign of recognition, his eyes scanning the car, the driveway, Marcus in his casual clothes, processing the scene purely through the lens of his prejudices rather than actually seeing the person standing in front of him. Marcus made the conscious decision at that moment not to identify himself immediately, wanting to see exactly how far Peterson would take this, how deeply his racial bias would blind him to the obvious. Peterson stopped about 10 feet from Marcus and began his interrogation with a question that immediately revealed his assumptions. He asked Marcus if the car was his, the tone implying he doubted a black man washing a car in that neighborhood was actually the owner. Marcus responded calmly, yes, it was his car, and asked if there was a problem. Peterson ignored the question and instead asked if Marcus lived at that house, gesturing to the residence behind him. Marcus confirmed, yes, he lived there, and again asked why he was being questioned while washing his own car on his own property. Peterson's body camera captured every word of this exchange, preserving evidence of an officer interrogating a citizen doing completely legal activity without any articulable suspicion or justification. Peterson then asked to see identification, saying he was checking the area for reports of suspicious activity. Marcus knew this was pretext. Washing a car wasn't suspicious activity, and he had no legal obligation to provide identification when he was on his own property not committing any crime. But he also recognized this as a teaching moment, an opportunity to let Peterson dig deeper before revealing exactly how deeply he had gotten himself into trouble. Marcus asked what specific suspicious activity Peterson was investigating, what behavior Marcus had exhibited that created reasonable suspicion. Peterson became vague and defensive, saying he had the right to check situations that seemed out of the ordinary. Marcus pressed further, asking what specifically seemed out of the ordinary about a man washing his car on a Sunday morning. The body camera captured Peterson stumbling over his response, eventually saying the car looked new and he was checking to make sure it wasn't stolen. Marcus pointed out the car was clearly registered with valid plates Peterson could verify through dispatch if he had legitimate concerns, and that simply seeing someone washing a car with valid plates in a residential driveway didn't create reasonable suspicion of vehicle theft. This was exactly the type of logic Marcus had taught his officers in training, the need to articulate specific facts, creating suspicion rather than relying on vague feelings or assumptions. Peterson, apparently realizing his justifications weren't holding up but unwilling to back down, made the decision to escalate. He told Marcus he could do this the easy way by providing identification or the hard way by being detained for further investigation. The threat was clear and completely inappropriate. Peterson was trying to use his authority to force compliance from someone exercising perfectly legal constitutional rights. Marcus felt anger rising but kept his voice level, telling Peterson he wasn't being detained because there was no legal basis for detention, that he was on his own property doing legal activity, and that Peterson needed to either articulate specific reasonable suspicion or leave. At this point, one of Marcus's neighbors, a white man in his early 50s named Robert Chen, who had lived on the street for a decade, came out to check what was happening. Robert knew Marcus well. They had backyard barbecues together, their kids played together, and Robert knew exactly what Marcus did for a living. He walked over and asked Peterson why he was harassing Marcus, noting Marcus was a police sergeant who lived in that house and was simply washing his car. Robert's intervention should have ended the incident immediately, an independent witness confirming Marcus's identity and residence. But Peterson, now clearly uncomfortable but apparently unable to admit his mistake, questioned how Robert knew Marcus was a police officer. Robert responded that everyone on the street knew because Marcus had lived there for years and sometimes wore his uniform when leaving for work. He also noted it was absurd Peterson was stopping someone for washing a car, and that he had seen dozens of neighbors wash cars over the years without ever having police questioning them. The implication was clear. The only reason Marcus was being stopped was his race. Peterson told Robert this wasn't his business and he should go back, but Robert refused, saying harassing his neighbor on his own property absolutely was his business. He took out his own cell phone and began recording, creating additional video angle beyond Peterson's body camera. Marcus finally decided he had seen enough of how far Peterson's bias would take him. He told Peterson to use his radio and call Sergeant Thompson to verify the situation. Peterson looked confused, asking who Sergeant Thompson was and why he would call a sergeant for a routine check. Marcus responded calmly that Sergeant Thompson was his supervisor on night shift, and that Peterson should absolutely want his supervising sergeant to know he was stopping and interrogating citizens without reasonable suspicion. The body camera captured the exact moment something started clicking in Peterson's brain, the name Sergeant Thompson echoing familiarly, but still not completely connecting with the man standing in front of him in a t-shirt and jeans instead of uniform. Marcus decided to end the charade. He told Peterson directly, in a clear voice captured perfectly by the body camera, that he was Sergeant Marcus Thompson, that Peterson worked under his direct supervision on night shift, that they had a briefing meeting together just 3 days earlier, and that Peterson was currently stopping and interrogating his own supervising sergeant without recognizing him, because apparently Peterson couldn't imagine a black man washing a car could be a senior police officer. The shock on Peterson's face was visible and immediate, his face going pale as realization sank in. His hands dropped from their defensive position near his utility belt, his mouth opened slightly, and his eyes widened with growing horror as he finally truly looked at the man he had been questioning and recognized his sergeant. Peterson began stuttering an apology, saying he hadn't recognized Marcus out of uniform, that he was just doing his job, that he meant no disrespect. But Marcus cut him off, his voice still calm but with underlying steel that made clear this was now an official matter and not a casual interaction. Marcus told Peterson he had just demonstrated blatant racial profiling by stopping a citizen doing completely legal activity without any articulable suspicion, that he had escalated the situation by threatening detention when confronted about his lack of legal justification, and that he had done all of this while his body camera recorded every second of his misconduct. Marcus also noted the fact he hadn't recognized his own sergeant revealed. Peterson saw him first as a suspicious black man before seeing anything else about him. Robert Chen was still recording on his phone, capturing the moment from his angle as Peterson stood there, looking like he wanted the ground to open and swallow him. Robert commented aloud that he had witnessed the entire interaction from the beginning, that he could attest Marcus had done nothing remotely suspicious, and that Peterson had clearly stopped Marcus based purely on race. He also noted he had seen other neighbors, all white, washing cars in that same driveway over the years without ever having a police officer stop to question them about whether the cars were stolen or if they actually lived there. The comparison was devastating, direct witness evidence that Marcus was being treated differently because of his race. Marcus instructed Peterson to return to his vehicle and wait while Marcus called his shift commander to report the incident. Peterson tried to protest, saying there was no need to involve senior supervisors, that this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved between them. But Marcus made absolutely clear this wasn't negotiable. He was a supervising sergeant who had just witnessed one of his own officers engaged in clear racial profiling, captured on video with multiple witnesses. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug or handled informally. This required official investigation, review of all video evidence, and appropriate determination of whether Peterson should continue serving as a police officer given his apparent racial bias and inability to follow basic training about when stops were justified. Peterson reluctantly returned to his patrol car while Marcus grabbed his cell phone and called Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, the day shift commander who supervised Peterson and other patrol officers during weekend shifts. Marcus explained the situation calmly but completely. He was at his own home on his day off, washing his car in casual clothes, when Peterson stopped him without reasonable suspicion, questioned whether the car was his and if he lived there, demanded identification without legal justification, threatened detention when Marcus exercised his rights, and persisted even after a neighbor confirmed Marcus's identity and residence. Marcus also noted the entire incident had been captured both on Peterson's body camera and Robert's cell phone video, and that this represented not just individual misconduct, but systemic training failure. If Peterson truly didn't understand, he couldn't stop people based purely on race. Morrison responded with immediate shock and concern, saying she was on her way and that Peterson should remain on scene without making additional contact with Marcus. She arrived 12 minutes later, accompanied by Captain James Rodriguez, one of the department's division commanders who had been alerted to the situation involving a supervising sergeant being racially profiled by one of their own officers. Rodriguez and Morrison first approached Marcus, apologizing profusely for what had happened and assuring him the incident would be investigated fully. They then went to Peterson, who was still sitting in his patrol car looking like he might be sick, and instructed him to return to the station immediately and make no additional statements without union representation present. But before Peterson could leave, Marcus made a specific request. He wanted Rodriguez and Morrison to see the body camera recording now, on scene, while everything was fresh and witnesses were still available. He wanted them to understand exactly how bad this had been, not through second-hand reports, but by watching the video evidence directly. Rodriguez agreed, and they used the laptop in his supervisor vehicle to review Peterson's body camera footage. The 20 minutes of recording showed everything in clear detail. Peterson stopping without reason, asking accusatory questions, failing to articulate specific suspicion, threatening detention, dismissing neighbor intervention, and finally, the shock of realizing he had been interrogating his own sergeant. Rodriguez and Morrison watched in increasingly heavy silence, occasionally exchanging glances that communicated their shared horror at how indefensible this was. When the video ended, Rodriguez turned to Marcus and said that while he appreciated Marcus maintaining his composure during the incident, as a sergeant and as a senior police officer, Rodriguez understood this was both deeply personal and professionally violating. He assured Marcus that Peterson would be immediately removed from patrol duties, that a full investigation would be conducted by both the Internal Affairs Division and independent outside investigators, and that all video evidence would be preserved and reviewed by multiple layers of supervision. Morrison added she would be personally reviewing Peterson's stop history to determine if there was a pattern of racial profiling in his other interactions, and that any problematic patterns would be addressed through appropriate discipline. Peterson was placed on immediate administrative leave that same afternoon, removed from all patrol duties pending completion of the Internal Affairs investigation. His body camera recording was formally preserved as evidence, copied to multiple secure locations with documented chain of custody, and flagged as top priority for review. Robert Chen's cell phone video was voluntarily provided to the department as additional corroborating evidence, offering a different angle that clearly showed Peterson's body language and demeanor throughout the interaction. Together, the recordings created a comprehensive and irrefutable record of an officer stopping his own supervising sergeant based purely on racial profiling, failing to articulate any legitimate legal justification, and escalating the situation by threatening detention when challenged about his actions. News of the incident spread through the police department with breathtaking speed. By Monday morning, every officer in the department had heard some version of the story about Peterson stopping Sergeant Thompson in his own driveway without recognizing him. Reactions ranged from shock to embarrassment to anger that one of their own had been treated this way. Multiple officers who worked under Marcus's supervision reached out to express support and disbelief that Peterson could be so blind to his own prejudices. Some younger officers who had worked alongside Peterson began recalling incidents that now seemed problematic in light of what had happened, moments where Peterson had made stops that seemed based more on race than actual behavior. The Internal Affairs Division initiated its investigation within 24 hours, assigning 2 senior investigators to conduct full review, not just of the incident with Marcus, but of Peterson's entire patrol history since graduating the academy. What they discovered was a troubling pattern that should have triggered intervention months earlier. In his 8 months of patrol, Peterson had made 47 traffic stops. Of those 47 stops, 34 involved black motorists, despite black residents representing only 18% of the population in his assigned patrol zone. Of stops involving white motorists, 85% resulted in verbal warnings without citation. Of stops involving black motorists, 62% resulted in citations or arrests. The statistical data painted a clear picture of an officer disproportionately targeting black citizens and treating them more harshly than white motorists for similar infractions. Investigators also reviewed Peterson's report narratives for his stops, looking at how he articulated reasonable suspicion or probable cause. In multiple cases, his justifications were vague or pretextual. Vehicles matching descriptions from theft reports that turned out to be completely different makes and models. Erratic driving behavior that dashcam reviewers couldn't detect in video. Suspicious bulges that turned out to be normal wallets or cell phones. In one particularly problematic case 3 weeks before Marcus's incident, Peterson had stopped a black man driving a Mercedes in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, questioning whether the vehicle was stolen despite it having valid plates and no traffic violations. The motorist had complained to the department, but the complaint had been filed away as a misunderstanding without significant investigation or corrective action. Police Chief Raymond Hayes, facing what he immediately recognized as a potential public relations disaster and legal liability, ordered the investigation expanded to include supervisors who had failed to review and address Peterson's problematic stop patterns. If the data showed clear pattern of racial profiling over months, why had no supervisor noticed or intervened? Lieutenants and captains responsible for reviewing officers' stop reports and identifying troubling patterns were questioned about why they had failed to flag Peterson's stop statistics for review. Their responses revealed systemic failures in supervision. Some admitted they simply signed off on reports without looking at aggregated data. Others said they had noticed the numbers but assumed Peterson was just patrolling high-crime areas where more black residents lived. The body camera video was reviewed by multiple layers of departmental supervision, each arriving at the same inevitable conclusion. Peterson had engaged in blatant racial profiling without any legitimate legal justification. The video evidence showed him stopping Marcus purely because he saw a black man washing a car in a neighborhood where Peterson apparently didn't expect to see black residents. Peterson's attempts to justify the stop post hoc with vague references to suspicious activity reports or stolen vehicle checks crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. The video also captured Peterson threatening detention without probable cause, a Fourth Amendment rights violation that was both against the law and against departmental policy. Marcus provided a formal statement to internal affairs investigators, detailing not just the incident itself, but the broader context of why he had allowed it to continue before revealing his identity. He explained that as a sergeant responsible for training and supervising junior officers, he needed to understand whether Peterson was genuinely confused or operating based on racial bias that blinded him to the obvious. The fact Peterson hadn't recognized him, despite multiple interactions at work, revealed Peterson didn't see Marcus as an individual or fellow officer, but first and foremost as a black man to be suspicious of. Marcus also noted that if this could happen to him, a uniformed police sergeant in his own neighborhood, how many other black people had Peterson stopped and harassed without justification who didn't have the resources or knowledge to challenge his actions? The story inevitably leaked to media within 5 days, though the department had tried to keep the investigation confidential while it was ongoing. Once news broke, it exploded through local and national news platforms with headlines like, "Police officer stops own sergeant for racial profiling," and "Cop fails to recognize black supervisor washing car at home." The sheer absurdity of the incident, combined with irrefutable video evidence, captured public attention in ways that made people simultaneously laugh at Peterson's incompetence and be outraged at the deeper implications. If a police sergeant in his own neighborhood wasn't immune to racial profiling by his own officers, what hope did the average black citizen have of being treated fairly? The Police Officers Union initially tried to defend Peterson with a weak statement about officers doing their best to keep communities safe and deserving the benefit of the doubt. But when the body camera video inevitably leaked online and was viewed millions of times within 48 hours, even the union backed away from their support. The video was simply too damning, too clearly showing an officer stopping someone without justification and then being shocked to discover the person was his own boss. The union president gave a second statement, acknowledging Peterson's actions appeared problematic and that they wouldn't interfere with appropriate disciplinary process, effectively abandoning Peterson to his fate. Law enforcement experts and constitutional law professors appeared on news segments dissecting the video and explaining the multiple layers of problems it revealed. They pointed out Peterson had violated basic training about when stops were justified, that he had failed to articulate any specific facts creating reasonable suspicion, and that his stop pattern demonstrated clear racial bias his supervisors should have detected and addressed months earlier. Civil rights organizations used the case as a perfect example of why data on police stops disaggregated by race was so important, noting that without reviewing statistical patterns, departments allowed biased officers to operate unchecked until they finally did something so blatant it couldn't be ignored. The black community in the Riverside Heights area where Marcus lived organized a solidarity vigil, with neighbors sharing their own stories of being stopped by police without apparent reason beyond being in predominantly white neighborhoods. Robert Chen, the neighbor who had intervened and recorded part of the incident, spoke at the vigil about his growing awareness of how his black neighbors lived fundamentally different experiences with law enforcement. He noted that in a decade living on that street, he had washed his own car countless times without ever having a police officer question whether the vehicle was his, or if he lived there, a privilege he had taken for granted until witnessing what Marcus experienced. The internal investigation report was completed 4 weeks after the incident, and its findings were devastating for Peterson and embarrassing for departmental supervisors. Investigators determined Peterson had violated multiple departmental policies, including prohibitions against racial profiling, requirements to articulate reasonable suspicion before stops, and standards of professional conduct. The report specifically found Peterson had stopped Marcus without any legal basis, that his stop pattern over 8 months demonstrated statistically significant racial bias, that he had threatened illegal detention when challenged about his actions, and that he had failed to recognize his own supervising sergeant because his prejudices prevented him from seeing Marcus as a fellow police officer. The report also severely criticized 3 mid-level supervisors for failing to review and address Peterson's stop data that showed clear racial pattern. The investigators' recommendation was Peterson's immediate termination and disciplinary action, ranging from written reprimands to unpaid suspensions for supervisors who had been negligent in their review responsibilities. Chief Hayes accepted all recommendations without hesitation, understanding any attempt to defend Peterson or minimize the misconduct would be both legally indefensible and politically disastrous. Peterson was officially fired 6 weeks after stopping Marcus. His brief 8-month career in law enforcement ended by a pattern of racial profiling that culminated in the spectacularly embarrassing act of stopping and interrogating his own supervising sergeant without recognizing him. The State Board of Police Standards and Training revoked his certification permanently, ensuring he could never work as a law enforcement officer anywhere in the state. But the consequences extended beyond just Peterson's firing. The department faced intense public scrutiny about its recruitment, training, and supervision practices. How had Peterson made it through the academy without instructors identifying his racial prejudices? Why hadn't his supervisors reviewed his stop data and recognized the problematic pattern? How widespread were racial profiling and bias among other officers if even a black sergeant in his own neighborhood wasn't immune? These questions led the City Council to commission an independent audit of all departmental practices related to racial bias, training on constitutional rights, and supervision systems to identify officers with troubling stop patterns. Marcus became a reluctant public figure, invited to speak at law enforcement conferences and training seminars about his experiences, both as a victim of racial profiling and as a supervisor working to address bias within his department. He emphasized in his speaking that the problem wasn't just Peterson as an individual, but systemic failures that allowed Peterson to operate without adequate supervision, despite clear data showing racial pattern. Marcus also noted he had advantages most racial profiling victims didn't have. He knew the law perfectly, had authority as a sergeant to demand accountability, and had been captured on video from multiple angles. How many other victims of Peterson or officers like him had never gotten justice because they didn't have these advantages? Marcus continued serving as a sergeant in the department, but the incident had changed him in profound and lasting ways. He became hyper-vigilant about reviewing stop data for officers under his supervision, looking specifically for patterns that might indicate racial bias before they escalated to serious incidents. He implemented mandatory monthly reviews where each officer on his team had to explain their stops from the previous month, articulate the reasonable suspicion for each one, and justify any disparities in how they treated motorists of different races. Some officers initially resisted what they saw as micromanagement, but Marcus made clear he wouldn't allow another Peterson to operate under his supervision unchecked. His personal experience of being racially profiled had given him perspective he couldn't ignore, and he used his authority as a sergeant to ensure accountability wasn't just a buzzword, but actual practice. The car wash Marcus had begun that Sunday morning was never completed. His car sat partially soaped in his driveway for hours while he dealt with supervisors, investigators, and the avalanche of attention that followed. When he finally had opportunity to finish the job days later, he found the experience had been permanently tainted. Each time he washed his car now, he found himself watching the street, observing if patrol cars were passing, mentally preparing for the possibility of being stopped and questioned again. The simple, mundane activity of car maintenance had become loaded with anxiety and hypervigilance he couldn't turn off. Marcus recognized this as a form of trauma, the psychological impact of discovering that not even in his own home on his day off was he safe from being seen as suspicious first and person second. Peterson disappeared from public life after his firing, his attempts to rebuild his career frustrated by the viral video that became permanently associated with his name. Online searches for Kyle Peterson police immediately brought up the body camera video and dozens of news articles about how he had stopped his own sergeant for racial profiling. He tried applying for jobs in private security, but employers invariably discovered his background through background checks and rejected him, not wanting the liability of hiring someone with documented history of racial bias. Peterson eventually moved to another state and found work in a completely unrelated field. His law enforcement career aspiration permanently ended at 24 by a pattern of behavior he had never recognized or addressed until it was too late. Robert Chen, the neighbor who had intervened and documented the incident, became an active advocate for racial justice in his community. He used the cell phone video he had captured as a teaching tool in community workshops about citizens' rights during police encounters and why witnesses intervening and documenting potential misconduct was so important. Robert spoke openly about his own education through the incident, acknowledging that before witnessing what happened to Marcus, he had naively assumed racial profiling was an exaggerated problem or thing of the past. Seeing his neighbor, a respected police sergeant, be treated as a criminal suspect in his own driveway had forced Robert to confront the reality that race still fundamentally shaped how people were perceived and treated by law enforcement. The independent audit commissioned by the City Council was completed 8 months after the incident, and its findings forced the department to implement comprehensive reforms. The audit found that while Peterson's case was particularly blatant, it wasn't an isolated aberration. Review of 5 years of stop data revealed statistically significant disparities in how department officers stopped and treated motorists of different races. Black motorists were stopped at disproportionately high rates, were more likely to be searched, and were more likely to be cited or arrested rather than given verbal warnings. The disparities couldn't be explained by differences in driving behavior or crime rates, suggesting racial bias was influencing officers' decisions about who to stop and how to treat people once stopped. The department was ordered to implement an early warning system that would automatically flag officers whose stop data showed significant racial disparities, requiring supervisory review and corrective training before patterns became entrenched. The department also had to implement an enhanced stop tracking system that captured not just race of motorists stopped, but specific reasons for stops, outcomes, and whether searches were conducted. This data would be publicly reported quarterly to allow community and researchers to identify patterns and hold the department accountable. Implicit bias training, which had been a 4-hour online course officers completed once yearly, was replaced with mandatory quarterly in-person training involving scenario role-playing and honest reflection about how personal prejudices could influence professional decisions. Perhaps most significantly, the audit recommended creating an independent civilian review board with power to investigate racial profiling complaints and recommend discipline. The board would include community members, particularly from communities of color disproportionately affected by racial profiling, and would have access to all body camera recordings, stop data, and disciplinary records. Officers initially resisted what they saw as outside oversight, but progressive departmental leaders like Marcus argued independent accountability was necessary to rebuild community trust that had been eroded by years of unaddressed racial profiling. The board began operating 1 year after the incident, and within its first 6 months had identified 5 additional officers with troubling stop patterns similar to Peterson's, all of whom were subjected to retraining and increased supervision. CWK. Body camera video of the incident became one of the most widely used police training tools in the country, shown at police academies as a perfect example of multiple failures happening simultaneously. Instructors used the video to teach recruits about implicit bias and how unexamined prejudices could literally prevent officers from recognizing people they interacted with regularly once those people were outside of context. The video also demonstrated why articulating specific reasonable suspicion before stops was so critical, showing how Peterson's attempts to justify the stop post hoc crumbled when he couldn't point to any actual behavior creating suspicion. And most fundamentally, the video forced recruits to confront the uncomfortable reality that their own assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces or who looked suspicious could be based on race rather than facts. Marcus occasionally reflected on that Sunday morning and the surreal absurdity of being stopped by his own officer while washing his car. The experience had been simultaneously outrageous and revelatory, showing him that not even his position as a police sergeant protected him from being seen first as a suspicious black man. He thought about how many other encounters like this had happened that were never captured on video, never resulted in accountability, never forced departments to confront their patterns of racial bias. His case had received attention because it was so visibly absurd, an officer stopping his own boss, but Marcus knew the underlying problem of racial profiling affected ordinary people every day who didn't have sergeant authority or multi-angle video evidence to validate their experiences. The incident also changed how Marcus trained new officers. He began using his own experience as a case study, telling recruits about being stopped in his driveway and having them reflect on what that revealed about how bias could operate even among fellow officers. He challenged recruits to examine their own assumptions about who looked suspicious or out of place, asking whether their decisions about who to stop were based on specific behavior or demographic characteristics. Some recruits resisted the uncomfortable self-reflection, but others recognized Marcus's training was necessary precisely because it was uncomfortable, forcing them to confront prejudices that might otherwise operate unexamined. Marcus's home in Riverside Heights remained his residence, but the driveway where everything had happened never felt quite the same. Neighbors sometimes stopped by when he was washing his car or doing yard work, checking if everything was okay, remembering the incident that had transformed their quiet street into a focal point for national discussions about racial profiling. Most neighbors were supportive, some sharing their own stories of experiencing or witnessing discriminatory treatment, others acknowledging the incident had opened their eyes to realities they're black. Neighbors faced that they had never considered. The incident had changed the neighborhood's culture in subtle but significant ways, creating more awareness and willingness to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment. Peterson tried multiple times over the years to reach Marcus through intermediaries, allegedly wanting to apologize and seek some kind of reconciliation or forgiveness. Marcus declined all such approaches, making clear through his attorney he had no interest in making Peterson's journey easier through absolution or forgiveness. Peterson had demonstrated a pattern of racist behavior over months, had stopped and harassed black people without justification, and had only faced real consequences when he made the spectacularly stupid mistake of doing it to his own sergeant. Marcus didn't owe Peterson emotional comfort or closure, especially when Peterson apparently wanted it more for his own peace of mind than genuine change or accountability. The 3 supervisors who had failed to review and address Peterson's stop data faced disciplinary action, ranging from 2-week unpaid suspensions to demotion in rank. Their careers survived, but were permanently tarnished by the fact they had allowed a biased officer to operate unchecked under their supervision. One eventually retired early, apparently unable to deal with the constant reminder of his failure. The other two remained in the department but were moved to administrative roles where they didn't supervise patrol officers, trust in their supervisory judgment permanently impaired. The lasting legacy of the case extended far beyond one fired officer or one department's reforms. It became nationally cited in discussions about racial profiling, used in court cases establishing officers can't stop people without articulable reasonable suspicion, and incorporated into training curricula about how implicit bias operates. The video remained online, viewable by millions, a permanent reminder that racial profiling wasn't just a historical problem or theoretical concern, but a current reality that affected even respected police sergeants in their own neighborhoods. For Black communities, it offered validation of experiences they had reported for decades but were often dismissed or minimized. For law enforcement, it provided an impossible-to-ignore warning about consequences of allowing racial bias to operate unchecked. Marcus remained committed to his career in law enforcement, believing change had to come from inside the system rather than just criticism from outside. He eventually was promoted to lieutenant, overseeing multiple patrol teams and implementing accountability standards he had developed through his own experience. His officers knew he wouldn't tolerate racial profiling or pretextual stops, that he would review their data religiously, and that he would hold them accountable for the patterns their numbers revealed. Some saw this as burdensome, but most recognized Marcus's accountability made them better officers and protected both the communities they served and their own careers from mistakes that could end in viral videos. The morning of February 12, 2023, had begun with Marcus planning to spend his day off relaxing and doing household chores. Instead, it became a defining moment that exposed systemic failures in his department, ended a young officer's career, and forced reforms that would eventually affect how policing was conducted throughout the entire region. The black sedan Marcus had been washing when Peterson stopped him remained his property for years afterward, but he could never wash it without remembering that morning, without the heightened awareness that even in his own home doing the most mundane task, he could still be seen first as suspicious and only secondarily as a person, fellow officer, or supervising sergeant. And that awareness, though painful, informed his work as a law enforcement leader working to ensure racial profiling was addressed rather than ignored, that patterns were identified before they escalated, and that accountability wasn't just applied when officers made mistakes so spectacularly obvious they couldn't be swept under the rug.